Folks, strap yourself in. You're about to see one of the greatest pieces of investigative journalism to appear in American media or internet in 75 years. John Barbour's and Len Osanic's long-awaited tribute to William F. Pepper.
Our next guest is one of those rare talents who has something to say and can say it funny. He's a writer-performer on the new Laugh-In and one of the most popular, outspoken, and entertaining personalities on the local news here in Los Angeles. He's won a half a dozen Emmys as a film critic and host of his own shows. Let's welcome Mr. John Barbour, right over there.
Hi there, this is John Barbour, and I hope you are all doing well. And after you watch this show, you are going to be very well informed about one of the greatest men in American history, right up there with Jim Garrison. Over the 53 years that I've been trying to tell Mr. Garrison's story, I've had thousands of you say to me, there will be another, never be another Jim Garrison. But there is and was, and his name is William F. Pepper. Jim Garrison solved the murder of John Kennedy. William F. Pepper did him one better. Not only did he solve the murder of Martin Luther King, even having lunch with the shooter, he was the one who 5 years ago was arguing as Sirhan's attorney for his release with nothing but facts that Sirhan was not the shooter, and making the parole officer so angry. The parole officer said to him, "Hey, Bill, why don't you give it up? Sirhan is a political prisoner." When I think of the three greatest lawyers in American history, this is my little daydream. Those three lawyers are Jim Garrison, Abraham Lincoln, and William F. Pepper. And in my imagination, I put the three of them standing up in front of marble in Washington, D.C. And on the right of Abraham Lincoln is Jim Garrison. On the left of Abraham Lincoln is William F. Pepper. And I would say to Abe, "Hey, Abe, why don't you just sit down?" Because these two men stand alone as the leaders in this country, the two leading lawyers fighting for justice in America and in this world. When I did the first Jim Garrison documentary, Mr. Garrison spoke to me from his deathbed. When Len Osanic and Len happened to be one of William Pepper's very best friends, as you're going to find out shortly. When Len and I decided to do this long-delayed tribute to William F. Pepper, I found out that he was unable to talk to us because he is now on a sickbed. So we cannot hear him. But you will hear when he was on my show 5 years ago, twice, in May and in June, 5 years ago, when I had my show, John Barbour's World, on BBS Radio. So I called Doug and Don Newsom, the owners of that wonderful BBS broadcasting company, and asked them if they still had the archives of those two shows. And in 5 minutes, I had the audio tapes right here by my side. And in a minute, you are going to have them in your heart and in your soul. When he was on the first time, I asked him, because he was a lot like Garrison. Garrison first believed the Warren Report because he believed in the authority of the government. And William was exactly the same way until he went to Vietnam as a photojournalist. And what he discovered there changed his mind. So my very first question was, what is it that you found in Vietnam that made you change your opinion about the country you were born in and living in, and what it was that you did that found its way to the eyes of Martin Luther King? And this is what he said.
Vietnam was the foundation of my relationship with Dr. King during the last year of his life. It was only then, that last year, that I came to know him. Like a lot of young Northerners, I was in the South off and on in the 60s, and a part of that struggle, really nothing more than a foot soldier, and I never knew Martin King at that point in time. But when I went to Vietnam as a journalist, an independent journalist, accredited by MACV, that was an earth-changing experience for me, because for the first time I confronted directly the American criminal war machine against a beautiful and ancient people. I stayed out in the country during the time I was there, rather than spending Fridays in Saigon at the press conferences, and was in shelters and orphanages and in rural areas, mostly in the Central Highlands area. We were hit at one point when I was in a C-130 coming in to play coup, and rather rough landing, and injured my back, which cut short the time that I was there. But all that time and that period, I took a great number of photographs and recorded what I was seeing. And what I was seeing were war crimes. There was napalming of villages, the use of white phosphorus that burned through to the bone, the killing of women and children and elderly people who were often the only residents in these villages, that had to be wiped out as the American forces tried to drive the people into controlled settlement camps. And so when I came back, I, for the first time, recorded what I had seen and developed the photographs of what I had seen. And Martin King read an article that I wrote for Ramparts magazine, which you folks out on the West Coast, may remember as
it was a wonderful magazine. They did some wonderful stuff with Jim Garrison also.
Yeah, just a wonderful independent magazine publication led by Warren Hinkle and Bob Scheer, who is still, of course, an active force in the progressive politics of this country. And they published this piece of mine called The Children of Vietnam in January of 1967. Martin was a subscriber to Ramparts, and he read this piece, saw this piece for the first time when he was at the Atlanta airport on his way to Jamaica, and he started going through it and looking at the photographs. And
he was eating a meal at the time, wasn't he?
Well, yeah. Bernard Lee went to get him some food. Bernard, of course, was his bodyguard, and Bernard went to get him some food and brought food back to him, and he pushed it away. And Bernard said, "Well, what's the matter, Martin? Aren't you hungry?" or something like that. And he said, "Bernard, I can't eat any food. After what I've seen, I don't think I'll ever again be able to enjoy a meal after what I'm reading and what I'm looking at here." Well, when he came back to the States, he asked me to meet with him. He reached out, asked me to meet with him, and open my files. And I did, and he openly wept. This great, good man openly wept. He couldn't believe that his country was doing what it was doing to these people. And he became determined then to oppose the war in Vietnam, as he was always inclined to do from the beginning, but now he had a fevered commitment. And he delivered his strong, powerful speech at Riverside Church on April 4, 1967, just 1 year to the day when he was assassinated. He delivered this speech. And in the course of that, asked me, and with his colleagues, asked me if I would become director of a new politics organization. And the strategy was to develop a third party, an independent party that would run against Lyndon Johnson and attempt to make peace and freedom the core issues of a national political campaign. and that ticket was to be headed by him and Dr. Benjamin Spock. I proposed that at a massive rally in front of the United Nations on April 15, 1967, and there was a resounding approval that this should be this progressive force at that point in time.
Was this around the time he gave that magnificent speech at the church in New York?
Yeah, well, he delivered the speech that you're talking about on April 4, 67. This was 11 days later, April 15, following a massive march and demonstration to New York. And it was
the speech was at the Riverside Church, right?
Yes, it was the first speech was at the Riverside Church, and then at the United Nations rally, he spoke again. I introduced and proposed this ticket, and agreed to head the National Conference for New Politics. And you know, John, we were so naive in those days. We built an organization. We held a convention in over Labor Day '67 in Chicago, the Palmer House Hotel. A convention that was heavily infiltrated by subversive elements, gang members, and people like that.
What those subversive elements were, William, which is shocking, and most people do not know, they were black. Now, when he spoke again at the United Nations, did he repeat what he said at the Riverside Church? I remember it distinctly. He said that he hated to say that the greatest terrorist organization in the world was the United States government and the Pentagon. Did he repeat that again?
Yes. That was a common theme. That was a common theme of his work and his speeches thereafter. But you're quite right. The major subversive elements that were controlled by the government and infiltrated the convention, which was an incredible convention. 5,000 delegates from all over the country. Every major liberal and radical organization was represented there. But a Black Caucus was formed, brutally formed, and put into effect. And all of the black delegates were herded into this Black Caucus. And at the convention on the opening night, I introduced him, and he spoke about the need for a political alternative, a nonviolent alternative, and a nonviolent change in the policies of the government of the United States. And as he was speaking, a note was passed over my shoulder to me by one of the Black Caucus leaders, and the note said, "Get him out of here after he speaks, or we will take charge of him. We will abduct him and embarrass him before the world." His own people, black people, would abduct him and embarrass him before the world if you don't get him out of here. That's what they were saying.
Well, later on, William, I'll have some questions about that, because you obviously know that Dick Gregory goes around the country speaking at universities and places like that, and he says some astonishing things about some of the blacks who helped set up the murder of Dr. King. But before I get to that, at this time, did he have any contact with Malcolm X?
He had contact with Malcolm before this time. He had contact with Malcolm, and it was a semi-regular contact going back before Malcolm was killed, because Malcolm was killed in '65, 2 years before this. And he had contact with Malcolm in the early '60s, and they had begun a dialogue. And Malcolm was inclined to try to help him understand the difference between racism as it existed in the North and in the South. And they were developing, in those early years, from what I understand, they were developing a dialogue. And of course, when Malcolm was taken away from us, that dialogue ended.
A couple of things I remember about Malcolm, because Red Fox was my mentor in this business, strangely enough. He was the one that helped me become a comic and an entertainer, but his closest friend as a young man was Malcolm X. He used to tell me stories about Malcolm, so I followed Malcolm very, very carefully. And I remember one time in New York City, it looked as though there was going to be a massive race riot in New York City. And the governor and the mayor were going to call in the National Guard, and Malcolm called them and said, "Don't do that. Let me talk to them." Malcolm stood in front of what looked like 100,000 people and told them to go home. And they went home, and one of those in power said no black man should ever have that much power in this country. And shortly after he was killed. Now, when he was killed, what was Martin's reaction? Did he believe it was really black Muslims who might have done it? Or did he think the CIA or the federal government were involved?
Well, I think, I never discussed the assassination of Malcolm to any degree with Martin, but the underlying suspicion I know that he had was that this was an official assassination. He always questioned the loss of Jack Kennedy at a critical time in Kennedy's presidency when he was going to start removing the advisory troops that that were in Vietnam. He knew about Jack's fight over the Northwoods plan that they tried to put in place that was developed during the Eisenhower years. And they knew that he was committed to ending the oil depletion allowance that so empowered with enormous sums of money the oil and energy and the banking industries that served them.
Now, did Martin, after the death of Malcolm X, did Martin feel that he was going to be a target?
Martin believed that when he decided to take on the war, and when he decided to deal with the economic inequality of massive numbers of poor whites as well as blacks in America, that he was treading on ground that ultimately was going to lead to his death. The reason they killed Martin King was not just because he opposed the war, which meant he was denying the profits of war to the major power forces, corporate forces in the society. That was bad enough. But the major reason they killed him was because he was going to bring a massive number of Americans into Washington, not on a march in 1968, but for an encampment where they were going to stay there. And then they were going to go to the congressmen and senators and try to get back the funds that had been taken away from the social programs that had been put into the defense budget for the fighting of the war. And they believed very strongly, the military believed very strongly, as did their allies in government, that if he brought that mob to Washington, and if they camped, as they planned to, in the shadow of the Washington Memorial, and then went day after day to visit representatives in Congress and the Senate, that eventually that crowd was going to become so radicalized they would be a revolutionary force that could not be put down. They didn't have the troops to put them down. Westmoreland wanted 200,000 more for Vietnam. They didn't have those. They just simply did not believe they could stop the revolution that was going to take place. Remember what had happened in Paris. Remember that the French government was virtually overthrown by this type of growing alliance between workers and students and progressive people and radicals in Paris. And if it was not for André Malraux, de Gaulle would have fallen prey to that revolutionary force. But Johnson did not have an André Malraux. He did not have someone who saw how to deal with and how to co-opt those forces. That was done. Of course, the students were left alone. The labor unions were co-opted, and then the Communist Party was co-opted, and that movement fell apart. But they didn't have that degree.
There were more FBI agents registered as communists in the United States.
There was no question of that.
The story that you told at this book gathering was so touching and moving. You talked about McNamara, I think, in Westmoreland, on top of the Pentagon, looking down at this crowd and talking about how they were going to handle it. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
Could you repeat it?
Well, I don't remember all of the details of how I presented at the time, but they panicked. They were in a panic every time there was a demonstration outside the Pentagon. And when Martin was talking about bringing in excess of 500,000 people there, they couldn't allow that to happen. And that was really why they had to take him out. Now, at this convention in 67, in Labor Day 67, they subverted it. They used thugs like the Blackstone Rangers in Chicago. They used gang members to coerce and to compel, under the guise of black nationalism, frankly, all of the blacks into this caucus. I had no choice when I got that note but to tell Martin and Andy Young, who was there at the time, that I'm afraid you have to go. You cannot hang around here. We have to carry on without you. And that's exactly what they wanted to happen because Martin was a unifier, and they had to get rid of him. He would have brought that group together as a major political force, and then after that, he was going to develop this incredible encampment in Washington. So they had to get rid of him, and we had to get him out of there for his own well-being at that point in time. But we didn't know, John, how naive we were. We didn't know the degree of subversion and provocation that the government was engaging in.
I would like you to get to the business of how they set up the assassination, because I know he wasn't originally supposed to stay at the Lorraine Motel, that J. Edgar Hoover had one of his media assets write a very nasty note about the fact that he was staying at a white-owned hotel, wasn't it? Why didn't he stay at a black-owned hotel, and he wasn't supposed to be on that floor that he was on? Describe to us how they set up the assassination of Dr. King.
Well, there were ongoing informal efforts to and contracts out on Martin King from the period of time that we're talking about to really right to the end. But the actual assassination was a much more sophisticated. I covered it in the civil trial in 1999. To some extent. At that trial brought out what evidence we had at the time. Remember, I started working on this case in 1977, and I got involved initially because Mark Lane asked me to stand in and represent Jerry Ray before the House Select Committee on Assassinations because they had disqualified him, saying he had a conflict of interest, which was a way of getting Mark out of that. So I represented Jerry during the HSCA hearings and brought an associate of mine, Flo Kennedy, a black woman lawyer, progressive lawyer from New York, brought her in as co-counsel. So that's how I got started on this matter. And then Ralph Abernathy asked me to keep involved and interrogate Ray in prison at Brushy Mountain Penitentiary. And I said to him, "What are you talking about, Ralph? I had thought I thought he went around the bend." I said, "What are you thinking Ray is innocent?" I hadn't been involved in any consideration of that. When Ben Spock and I went to the funeral and the memorial in Memphis, the funeral in Atlanta, I then walked away I was so distraught with politics, I walked away.
Did you not think there was some kind of conspiracy, or did you accept the fact
No, at that time I was distraught and depressed, and I basically just thought they had the right guy, and that this was a case as they represented it, as the official story represented it. And when we left, we were in Atlanta. Bobby Kennedy asked me to come up and talk with him. Of course, he was in the process of mounting his presidential campaign at the time. And what's not generally known is that I was Bobby's chairman in Westchester County, New York. He, as a very young guy with a large political following, Bobby asked me to be his citizens chairman when he ran for the Senate in New York in 1964. And here comes Abernathy in 1977 and said, "Look, I'd like you to come out to the prison, interrogate Ray." I said, "Ralph, I don't know anything about the case." It took me months to prepare for that. And that went on in 1977, 78. I spent 5 hours in prison interrogating James Earl Ray.
And Mark Lane was his attorney at the time,
Mark
right?
was his attorney at that time. And I put him through a terrible, stressful 5 hours. But we all came away after that with a strong belief, myself, Abernathy, Reverend Lawson, Jim Lawson, who's a very close friend of Martin's, and who brought him into Memphis, actually, the last time. And I brought a psychiatrist from a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who was a body language expert, and just told him, sit in the corner and just watch this guy as I put him through the stress and see what you think. We all came away with the belief that he was not the shooter, that he didn't kill him. What we didn't know was what role he might have played, and that's what took me from 78 to 88 before I agreed to represent him. Mark had dropped from the case. He was in prison. It was a dead end. It was not going anywhere. I kept visiting him, and he kept saying, "Well, will you please represent me? Please take." And I said, "I can't do that until I'm sure you had no knowing role in this assassination." It took me 10 years of investigating,
Wow.
living in the streets of Memphis, visiting the bars, talking to all the people, to come away with a thorough understanding that Ray was not the shooter and had no knowing participation. So then I took him on.
But you were trying at that time, when you began to believe that perhaps he was not the shooter, at that time you were trying to get him a new trial, right?
Oh, from 88 on, I did. I took his case. We lost at the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. I'm a member of that bar. And then we went on petition for cert to the Supreme Court. They denied us that, of course. And then I was able to get a television trial. HBO and Thames Television collaborated on a unscripted television trial with a jury chosen from all over the country at random. And we tried that case over a period of 10 days. The prosecution was led by Hickman Ewing, who had been a former assistant U.S. attorney in the Memphis area. And we fought bitterly that case over a period of 10 days. With the evidence that we had then in 1993, the jury took 7.5 hours to come back with a not guilty verdict for James Earl Ray.
I remember it. I remember it well.
We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty.
That opened the door, and evidence started flooding in from all over. And that led to the first book, Orders to Kill.
Terrific book, by the way.
We took that evidence in, and we went on and tried desperately to use that evidence to get a real trial for James. And
what were the reasons that the Supreme Court and the other courts along the way denied a trial?
These people become political prisoners. I mean, Sirhan is a political prisoner, no question about that. We have just lost at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Supposedly the most progressive court of appeals in this country has denied us what they call a certificate of appealability. We're not even allowed. We were denied the right to even appeal. And,
oh my goodness!
So I'm preparing another petition for cert on Sirhan's behalf, because there's no doubt in my mind at all, and you touched on some of the evidence. There's no doubt in my mind that Sirhan was a patsy and was also set up. But anyway, coming back to Martin, the effort to get him was much more sophisticated. They started profiling. Hoover organized the profiling of inmates in the Missouri correctional system.
William, excuse me, this was information that you gathered when you brought the civil case. Now, James Earl Ray dies. And
yes.
As a result of that death, you're now left with no way to get any kind of legal hearing in a court of justice. And you meet with Coretta King and her family. Tell us about that meeting, which resulted in the civil case.
Well, the King family was aware of my work for many years, but they stayed in the background. As the evidence piled up, and as we became more evident that Ray was a patsy and was not guilty of the crime, the family decided they had to know the truth. They had to get to the truth, and we agreed that I would bring a civil action against a man whom I had cornered for his involvement in the assassination, a man called Lloyd Jowers.
Wasn't that eventually just the widow's decision on her own?
Well, all of the children, with the exception of Bernice, who had was most. She didn't object, but it was so painful for her. She lost her father when she was 3 years old. But all of the children, Martin and Dexter and Coretta, decided that they wanted this civil action to go forward. And I had one very long and tearful meeting with them that went on for about 7 hours in Atlanta, where I opened the files to them, and they decided, yes, this is something we must do. So we brought this civil action. It went on for 30 days.
Against whom did you file it?
We filed it against Lloyd Jowers and others, agents of the government of the United States, the state of Tennessee, and the city of Memphis. Lloyd Jowers owned Jim's Grill, from behind which the shooter shot Martin King. Okay. Jowers collaborated. He brought the gun into the kitchen after the shooter had shot. He broke the gun down in front of a witness I eventually found and broke down myself, who had been a lover of his and who saw him do it, saw him bring the gun in and all of that. And she was silent for so many years because she thought he had actually done the shooting. He hadn't. He was simply out there to carry the gun in, and he collaborated. But we broke him down, and he eventually admitted that he had played this role, and he was afraid he was going to be prosecuted. And he thought if he cooperated with the King family and us, and that told us what happened, that they would not be so venomous toward him in terms of prosecution. So we brought the action against him. He was the defendant. And as I said, 70 witnesses in 1999 laid out what we knew at that point. And as a result of that trial, which was clearly established the innocence of James Earl Ray, it took the jury less than 30 minutes to come back and find that there was a conspiracy to assassinate Dr. King, and they put an overwhelming amount of responsibility on the government of the United States in particular. Jowers was a handyman, and so he had a lower level. But that led to the second book, Act of State, which you've referred to.
Were you able to subpoena members of the Memphis Police Department, FBI agents? Were you able to get them on the stand and put them under oath? And were you able to identify some of those working for the government who participated in this murder?
We were able to bring onto the stand representatives of the government, of the Memphis, Shelby County, and state of Tennessee government who were responsible for the investigation of the case. And they regretted deeply that's what they had to say because they didn't do any serious investigation. So we were able to do that, but we didn't have the degree of information that followed even that trial. Remember, that book came out in 2003. Now, 13 years later, the final book is coming out within the next few weeks. And that's the end of the case and the end of the story. That has everything.
Will you please come back to talk about that?
Yeah, when the book is out, and if you want me to come back, it's devastating. It's one of the most depressing experiences of my life to have uncovered.
What happened to the initial person against whom you brought the suit? This Joyner fellow, is he still alive?
No, he died. He died. He died.
Oh,
he was an old man.
At one point
he died.
Ask for immunity from prosecution and say that he would tell everything? Did he ever do that?
Yes, and they refused to even meet with him or discuss anything with him. I had an associate of mine sit outside the grand jury room for days trying to get in to lay this before a grand jury, and they wouldn't hear it. The case is politically controlled. They would not hear it.
So now I have to ask you two questions, which I'm sure you can't answer. And the first question would be, in winning the civil case, was there a financial judgment paid to the King family?
Only the amount of the cost of the burial. They did not seek money. That was not their purpose in bringing the action.
Oh, I see. Well, isn't a jury sometimes allowed on their own whim to bring a financial judgment against someone in the loss of a civil case? Can't they do that on their own?
We made it clear we were not interested in that, and we did not want the jury to do that.
How astonishing. Okay, now the verdict comes in, and you've obviously won. Why not? How many did the major news media and Newsweek and Time, and they all descend on you and want to get quotes?
No. In fact, they didn't attend the trial. What happened was they would come in when Coretta King was testifying, or Andy Young, or Dexter King, members of the family, were testifying. But when the key witnesses, the substantive witnesses with serious evidence testified, they left the room. They did not cover it. One local ABC reporter who was so angry and so fascinated by the whole thing that he insisted on staying in there and filming the whole trial. And we, of course, filmed the trial ourselves. But he lost his job. He was fired. They were all told not to cover this case. when I started this,
You did the HBO show. Now, since you have this on film, could you not go back to HBO and say, hey, do you want to see the real trial now?
they didn't want it. They didn't want to hear it. Court TV was going to do it, and then they were told back off. They didn't do it. The media is terribly controlled in this country, and it's gotten much worse in recent years than it ever was. You know, back in 1967, there was a glimmer of hope in terms of some independent media. There was a guy called Bill Atwood. Bill Atwood, whom you probably know and know of well, was the managing editor of Look magazine.
Yes.
When I came back and my piece was published in Ramparts about the war crimes being committed by the government of the United States, I had two reactions. Mike Wallace took me to lunch at Smith's and accused me of being a traitor and asked me how I could dare to accuse this government of war crimes. I almost put him through the wall. I was so angry with him. The difference is Bill Atwood. Bill wanted to run my Ramparts piece in Look magazine. Would you believe that? And he asked to meet with me, and I went in to meet with him, and we met for about 4 or 5, maybe 6 hours. But as soon as I came into the Look offices and he greeted me, he said, "You'll be interested to know I had a visitor last week." And I said, "Who would that be?" He said, "Averell Harriman came in to see me." I said, "What did Governor Harriman want?" He came up from Washington to see him. "What did Governor Harriman want?" He said, "Well, he brought me greetings from the President of the United States. And the President hoped I was well and doing well, and he had a favor to ask of me." I said, "What was the favor?" He said, "Well, President Johnson, through Harriman, asked me never to publish anything that Bill Pepper wrote." He said, "What do you think of that? You're not even 30 years old. The President of the United States is worried about my publishing something that you wrote about this war." Let me finish the Atwood thing, because he said to me, "What do you think of that?" And I said, "Well, I'm more interested in what you said to him. What was your response to Harriman about the president's request?" And he said, "Oh, I told him we were going to meet you next week, and if we believed what you were writing and what you were doing and what you were saying, we were going to publish. And by the way, give the president my best regards." Now, that was Bill Atwood, okay? And let me tell you a bit more about that. Atwood, the next week, met Jim Garrison. I don't know if you know this story. And Garrison came up and met with him, and they went on for a long time. And Atwood that night, at 1 o'clock in the morning, called Bobby. And he said, "Bobby, I've just been shaken, because I have, for the first time, heard District Attorney Garrison's story about the assassination of John Kennedy, and he indicates very clearly that he thought the CIA did it and organized it." And Bobby's response at 1 in the morning, after hearing this from Bill, who was, as you know, quite a close friend of the Kennedy family, said, "We know it, but I've got to get the White House in order to break it open, and I've got to do it myself." Well, Bill Atwood had a heart attack 3 hours later.
Oh, my God almighty.
4 a.m. in the morning, he had a heart attack. He left Look, never to return, except as a roving journalist occasionally. And he was off the scene. My work was never published. Garrison's story was never published. They brought in a new editor. They fired Chandler Broussard, who was the associate editor, who was really pushing for both stories to be heard. And Bill was gone, but he was a thoroughly decent human being.
Did you hear the name that William mentioned just before he had that fatal heart attack, when told that he shouldn't be printing some of this stuff of Garrison's or King's, or even the stuff of William Pepper's? Do you recall the name? It's Averell Harriman. And this sort of reinforces the truth of what Jim Garrison said to me on September 5th, 1981, when I put him on camera for 3.5 hours. We talked for another 8 hours, but at one point he stopped me and he said, "Oh, John, hang on, turn off the cameras and stuff. I do not like to speculate. But in this case, I want to tell you, off the record, that somebody above Allen Dulles gave the orders to murder John Kennedy." And I said, "Well, wasn't Allen Dulles the architect who engineered the killing?" He said, "Absolutely. But he was just an employee." And I said, well, hold on, how could he be an employee? Because during the Depression, I think the Dulles Bank lent $3 million to Adolf Hitler. He says, no, John, he was an employee. He was assigned to be head of the Central Intelligence Agency, which, as you know, is a hit squad for the corporate mafia that goes around the world creating fake wars and stealing all the natural resources from half of the countries in the world and murdering 500,000 people in doing so. He got his orders from Averell Harriman. And I said, well, how could that be? Wasn't Averell Harriman one of Kennedy's military advisors? And he says, that's absolutely right. And he was placed there by the ruling families to keep an eye on John Kennedy. His nickname was the Crocodile. He was really close to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower, as you know, is the one that sent the 12,000 advisors to Vietnam, and the Crocodile wanted 12,000 more. And John Kennedy kept fighting with him, saying, no, I am withdrawing 1,000 months so there will be no more American advisors there when the election rolls around in 1964. Well, the Crocodile did not want to see an election that would bring John Kennedy back to office. So what he did, he sent a memo. It's called 243. You can see it on Wikipedia. He sent it to Henry Cabot Lodge with the order to off Diem in Vietnam. Diem was the one to whom John Kennedy was talking because Diem was the one that John Kennedy hoped would become the leader in a unified Vietnam. And they murdered Diem. Henry Cabot Lodge and the CIA murdered Diem, and 3 weeks later, John Kennedy was murdered. This memo was sent without any consultation by Averell Harriman to the president, and Bobby Kennedy found out about it afterwards. And they came to blows in the office over this memo. And Harriman went to the New York Times and said, the Kennedy brothers are both nuts. So I am so pleased that William Pepper told this story about Atwood and Averell Harriman because it also reinforces the brilliance of Jim Garrison. Now, back to the rest of the story.
James Earl Ray, who had been my client for 10 years, died in 1998. Normally that would be the end of this struggle for truth because we had tried to get James a trial, had tried to get even an evidentiary hearing for him, and we were unsuccessful. But in a conversation with the family of Dr. King, I suggested that since we had so much evidence on, and really admissions on from this Mr. Lloyd Jowers, who owned the grill. It was a downstairs grill underneath the rooming house that backed onto the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was staying.
William, excuse me, exactly what did Jowers admit to as far as his participation was concerned, and how much money changed hands?
Jowers admitted finally to being out in the brush area with the shooter and a spotter, though he would never name the shooter. I had to get to that later. He would not name the shooter, but he admitted to being out there and in the bushes. And after the fatal shot was, or near fatal shot, was fired, he admitted after pressure and testimony from a witness who saw him, he admitted taking the rifle from the shooter, bringing it back in through the back door of the kitchen to his little cafe grill, and breaking it down in front of a woman who had been his lover named Betty Spates. And it was Betty who described that whole scene of him running in white as a ghost with the rifle, breaking it down, and saying, "You wouldn't ever do anything to hurt me, would you, Betty?" And of course, and on the further moment, she said, "No, Lloyd, of course I wouldn't." But it was many years later, like 24, 25 years later, that I got Betty to tell this whole story.
How much money did Bauer say he was paid?
Well, Jowers had a gambling debt to a man named Frank Liberto. Frank Liberto was one of Carlos Marcello's henchmen in Memphis. And that gambling debt was to be forgiven. And he was given in the area of $100,000, which he put in a stove in the back kitchen of his grill. And eventually took that money and bought a taxi cab company after the assassination. So that was the money that he was given.
The astonishing thing to me was you said that your client, James Earl Ray, died in 1998, but you got Jowers, I think you got him to admit on ABC television, I think it was a primetime show about this. Could you expand on that? That was 1993, I believe, wasn't it?
Yeah, Jowers was in a very difficult position because increasingly he knew that we had evidence against him, and he was actually afraid that he was going to be indicted. He never really understood the fact that the power structure was not ever going to indict him. They only wanted to cover up the whole assassination, and he would have benefited from that. He was afraid he was going to be indicted. So he started to come forward and admit his involvement early on, but it was only when we really had him in the late 90s and we started the lawsuit against him that we were able to deal with the facts of his involvement.
Well, didn't he say on that ABC special, that primetime special, that James Earl Ray had nothing to do with the shooting? Didn't he say that?
He basically said that. I don't know that he completely absolved James. I don't remember all the text of what he said, but he, by claiming acknowledging his own involvement, he basically absolved James. Yes.
And you said in the book, which did not surprise me in the least, that was major news, and not even ABC News carried that story.
No. The mainstream media has blocked the truth on this case forever.
Well, as in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, where Ruby was given the assignment to off Oswald, wouldn't the government have been better off if they had offed James Earl Ray? And didn't they try to?
They did try. They did try to get rid of James on a couple of occasions. Even once allowed him to escape from prison in Brushy Mountain Penitentiary. And the idea, they had a couple of snipers in there, and the idea was to kill him and not take him back, allow him back into the prison. So there were various efforts to get rid of James, but none of them really succeeded.
For you,
obviously.
What was the most astonishing or surprising thing when you got into the case? Because as I read the book, I see there were a number of civilians and a number of low-life folk in there, and all of a sudden, in creeps military intelligence somewhere along the way. Did that surprise you at all, or did you expect that the government at that high of a level would have also taken up the task of killing King?
Well, I wasn't totally surprised, but I didn't realize the extent to which the planning went as far up as it did. I didn't anticipate the specific involvement of Clyde Tolson, who kept coming and going from Memphis with instructions and money he was carrying for J. Edgar Hoover, he was number 2, as you know, to Hoover, and he was Hoover's lover. And he was in and out of Memphis on a regular basis, and he worked very closely with the Dixie Mafia, who had the obligations and undertook the work on the ground. So Tolson and Hoover were very much involved. Military intelligence, the 902nd Military Intelligence Group based in the Pentagon, had a backup role. They didn't kill or attempt to kill Martin King, but they were there. They had 2 snipers and 2 spotters, and they were there to kill. They were there to shoot if, in the event that the civilian shooter, who was a Memphis police officer, was not successful, they were going to shoot. They were not going to let Martin King leave Memphis. And so military intelligence was involved as a backup operation. They also were involved through psychological operations. They had 2 photographers on the roof of the fire station, and they photographed everything that took place.
What you've been listening to is an overview of how the government planned to kill Martin Luther King. It's from his book, An Act of State. But what you're about to hear now is the gut-wrenching truth, the soul-wrenching truth of how they did actually murder the king, and it was not by a gunshot to the neck or the throat. It is from his book, The Plot to Kill the King. And when you hear this story, like William F. Pepper, it should put you in a sickbed.
Do these photographs exist?
Oh, yes, of course they do.
Have you tried to get access?
Yes, we tried. We spoke to both photographers, or one of my emissaries spoke to both photographers, and the main photographs were sent back to Colonel Downey, who ran the 902nd Military Intelligence Group. They were sent back to Downey, but one of the photographers kept a set, and we negotiated and tried to get those photographs. And my agent made a mistake. He traveled into that meeting in Miami under his own name, and we were all under pretty heavy surveillance throughout this period. And the FBI followed him, and then as he was engaged in negotiations, they stuck a telephoto lens out the passenger side of their car, and that spooked the photographer, and he just then took off, and we were not successful in getting the photographs.
Is there any possible way that you could go to members of Congress with this information and have them demand to see the photographs?
No, they won't touch it. They don't want to touch this. You could always go to somebody in Congress, and somebody in Congress could ask the military to go into their archives, and because those photographs, I'm sure, exist. They, for the most part, will not touch this at all.
If this was as high then as military intelligence, and obviously it was, then there had to be, as in Dallas, there were key players in the Dallas Police Department involved with the murder of John Kennedy, participated in the murder of John Kennedy. There had to be people in the Memphis Police Department who were also going to be involved with the murder of Martin Luther King.
Of course there were. The director of police and fire was a man who Frank Holloman, was a man who primarily orchestrated the events on the ground. When the patriarch of the Dixie Mafia family died, Russell Adkins, about a year before, in July '67, the torch of assassination was passed to his son, Russell Jr., and but it became evident that Russell Jr. really was under the control and the consulting power of Frank Holloman, who was the director of police and fire. And Holloman had been in Hoover's office, worked as an administrator in Hoover's office for a number of years, was very close to Hoover and that operation. And he basically ran it. Memphis Police Department was heavily involved. The shooter of Martin King was a Memphis police officer.
His name?
Sorry?
His name is in the book.
His name is Frank Strausser, Straussser.
Tell us how you came upon him and how you happened to interview him. I mean, it's astonishing that you have all this information and nobody's suing you.
Well, I mean, I only state what I got from depositions in the book, and these are statements that witnesses have made under oath. And I'm quick to say and clear to say that these are allegations that people have made, and I don't testify to the absolute veracity or truthfulness of a lot of the allegations. I do say I don't believe these witnesses, and there were, as you know, a good number of witnesses, had any reason to lie under oath. And so they were deposed, they were sworn, they were deposed, they testified, they were filmed. I got to know who I came to receive allegations about as the shooter by a janitor who worked in the Memphis Police Department firing range. And he was the one who came forward and discussed and narrated for me, recited the activities on April 3rd and 4th of this shooter who was given a special rifle and who practiced continually with that rifle down at the shooting range, and then who left with the rifle at about 3:30 on the afternoon of the assassination and drove into Memphis. But he went beyond that. He also told me that every time anything new came up on the case and there was any publicity, that this same person would show up around his house in an unmarked car.
Oh, my goodness.
And once when he was going into his house to light, he lit a cigarette, he smelled gas. Someone had turned on the gas, and so he had to put out the cigarette very quickly. And then in the back garden, there was a tree that had a target shooting V that had been put up in the branches of the tree that came down and was aimed right at his back window. And then he was also told by this person, this alleged shooter, that he should come with him one day, and they were going to drive down and pick up some paychecks for the staff at the shooting range. And in the course of that journey downtown, the fellow showed his gun and also pumped him very heavily upon what he believed happened, and did he believe James Earl Ray was the shooter. So this guy really was very nervous about what this janitor, whose name was Lenny Curtis, very courageous man, so what he could have seen and what he could have heard, and made Lenny extremely anxious. I could not reveal Lenny's name for a number of years because I was afraid they would kill him, so I had to protect him. I asked the shooter to have lunch with me, and I offered to pay him $500 to have lunch with me, which he agreed. And in the course of that lunch, I confronted him and I said that Lloyd Jowers had named him as the shooter, and that was how I opened the door to his potential involvement.
Yeah,
so I lied to him.
In your book, I get a kick out of the fact that you sort of shyly say that you sort of had to lie to him about that Lloyd Jowers had mentioned his name.
Yeah.
And what was his response? His response, as I read it in the book, is like an admission that he did it.
Well, no, he was taken aback, and he said, he couldn't imagine why Jowers would say that about him. And then when I asked him to say where he was on the day of the shooting, he sort of fudged that all over the place, and he had no really clear recollection of where he was. And then I told him we had 2 plaster of Paris molds of footprints that we believe belonged to the shooter, who, after he shot, ran back toward the rooming house. And I said these were a very large size, around size 13, and it had rained much the night before, so these footprints were clear in the mud, and that's why the plaster of Paris molds were made. And I said to him then, I said, now tell me, Frank, what size shoe do you wear? And he looked at me with a little bit of a grin and said, 13 large.
Didn't he also say, why would they bother with me after 40 years or 30 years?
Well, he didn't say that to me, but he said that to one of my street people who knew him for 30 years and got into the back of his cab one day and confronted him unexpectedly and said to him, Frank, it looks as though Pepper's got a lot of evidence against you, and it's possible that you might get indicted for this shooting of King. And it was then he blurted out, "What are they going to? They're going to charge me with something I did 30 years ago or knew about."
Oh my gosh! Well, now two really disturbing things that I need to get into. One is, first of all, Dr. King was not going to originally stay at the Lorraine Motel. And J. Edgar Hoover got somebody to write an article about if, he's all for blacks, why doesn't he stay at a black establishment? So he changed to the Lorraine Motel. But wasn't he supposed to be on either the first or the second floor? And one of his associates talked him into moving up onto the balcony?
Well, not exactly like that, but he was supposed to be in room 202, which was a ground floor room that was heavily secured and safe, and that's why he was put there. And he was moved to room 306, which was an open-air balcony room. That's where.
Who encouraged him to move, though? Somebody had to talk him into moving.
You've got to understand this whole operation was coordinated by Dixie Mafia people on the ground. And Russell Adkins, who was the head of that mafia family, died, and then his son took over, but then Holloman came in, and Holloman, the director of police and fire, really ran the operation. Frank Holloman, from what I have been told under oath, again, by the son of Russell Adkins, Ron Tyler Adkins, told me, we had lengthy deposition of Ron Tyler Adkins, and he, as it was a kid, and he used to sit in on these meetings that involved his father in the planning, and his brother then, and Holloman, in the planning of the assassination. And he told me that his mother received a phone call from his elder brother, his son, Russell Jr., and his mother was told by Russell Jr. to organize the movement of Dr. King from that ground floor room to 306. So he remembers, and Ron was at her elbow when he says, now remember, these are depositions under oath, so they involve allegations. He was, and the allegations are not something I was privy to. I was not there. I can't testify that this is a fact. I can just report what I've been told under oath by a witness. And that's really what I'm doing, and I'm making it clear it's an allegation. And he heard her go get Jesse and ask Jesse to go to the owner of the motel and have Martin King's room changed. And that's what he heard. And in fact, of course, the room was changed. That's a matter of fact. Now, did Jesse Jackson actually carry out that instruction that was coming to him indirectly? I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't hear it. I'm just reporting what the scenario was that I've been told under oath. And I have to make it clear that these are allegations, even though they're sworn testimony. They're allegations.
Well,
Martin King was then moved from room 202 to room 306.
Well, you're well aware of the fact that, because I mentioned this to you last time, that Dick Gregory goes around and makes a very substantial living showing films and talking about the murder of Martin Luther King. And he has 3 times, at separate occasions, said that Jesse Jackson was a participant on behalf of the government to murder Martin Luther King, and he has yet to be sued by Jesse Jackson. And Dick sort of waffles at the name Ralph Abernathy. Now, Abernathy, understand from the book, was even in the hospital room with Dr. King.
Well, there are a lot of questions about Ralph that I have. There's no question about that. There are a lot of questions that I have about Ralph. I do know that Ralph was in the room with Martin King before Martin went out on the balcony. Ralph went to put some aftershave lotion or cologne on his face and therefore did not go out on the balcony with Martin.
The part of the book that rattled me, I literally had to stop reading and reread it 2 or 3 times. So I'm just going to, I wrote down the name of the woman who told you the story. It was a gunshot to the jaw. Describe the gunshot. Would it have been fatal? And what happened when they got the body to the hospital?
Well, the gunshot entered the side of the face and went on a downward path and exited, then re-entered again and went into Dr. King's back and did nick the spine. Didn't sever it, but nicked the spine. So it was a very serious wound. Would he have survived that gunshot? It's doubtful because he was very seriously wounded. He was taken to St. Joseph's Hospital and he was worked on in the emergency room of St. Joseph's Hospital, and he was still alive. He was breathing. They put a catheter in. They were giving him the best emergency treatment that was available. They didn't take him up to a neurological operating room, but they kept him in the emergency room. We're working on him there. The chief of surgery of the hospital was a fellow called Breen Bland, Breen-Bland, Dr. Breen Bland. He was also the family doctor of the Dixie Mafia family, the Russell Adkins family. He, at one point, had a meeting with Russ Adkins, and our witness, the son of Russell Adkins, was present at that meeting as a teenage boy. He often sat in on these meetings. His father started to involve him in the activities of the family from an early age. He remembered being taken to his first lynching when he was 6 years old.
Oh,
he was taken also by the father to the prison where the father delivered $25,000 to the warden in order to organize the escape of James Earl Ray. They had profiled James as an ideal patsy, and they had to organize his escape so he could be then moved around and controlled until they needed him. Well, Ron Tyler Adkins went with his father. He was about 15 years old, and they took it to the prison, gave it to the warden. So this was a young man who sat in on a lot of the activity and who knew much of the stuff that was going on. And he sat in on the one meeting between his father and their family doctor, Dr. Bland. And they were discussing the assassination, and Bland said to the father, you've got to make sure, whatever happens, if he isn't immediately killed by the bullet, then you've got to get him to my hospital, and I'll make sure that he doesn't leave alive.
Oh my!
So Martin King was not killed by the shot. He was gravely, seriously wounded, and but he was alive, and he was taken, and he was in the emergency room.
Excuse me, William. In the book, you mentioned first a woman who tells you this astonishing story.
This comes on.
Okay, and then the next thing is, how did she know there were military intelligence people in the hospital?
Well, first of all, she's not the only one. Everyone who was there at the hospital at that time saw people in uniform. There were military people all over the hospital. They were there, like it or not. They were all over the place. But what happened was she was a surgical nurse, and she was going in and out of the emergency room helping the doctors. And Dr. Bland came into the emergency room with two men in suits. I didn't know that they were military intelligence or who they were, but they were two men in suits. And they came in, and Bland said to the staff in the emergency room, stop working on that nigger and let him die. And now, all of you, get out of here. And he threw them all out of the emergency room. And as she was going out of the emergency room, she heard them gathering spit in their saliva in their mouths. And that caught her, that noise caught her attention, and she turned to look over her shoulder, and she saw the three of them spit on Dr. King's body, on the emergency room table, spit on his body. The catheter had already been pulled out from his throat, and she saw Dr. Bland take a pillow and put the pillow over his face and head and suffocate him to death. So she was kept in the hospital with the other staff overnight. They stayed there. They were only allowed to go the next morning. She went home. I never spoke to her. She died. But she called her family together the next morning, and her first words, she was very distraught and very depressed. And her first words, according to her son, whom we did depose under oath and filmed, she said, I don't know why they had to kill him. Why did they have to kill him, she said. She was beside herself with that. And this boy, Jonathan Shelby, her son, kept that with him all his life. He's today a diabetes victim. He's blind. And he came forward and he offered to tell this story. Now he tells the story. And once again, I'm having to say these are allegations that a witness is making, and we take them as best we can, and I can only say I have no reason to believe that he has any reason to lie about any of this. It was shocking and distressing for him to go through this, to carry it all these years, and for his mother to have suffered this. And to me,
didn't Ralph Abernathy go around saying that he was there until the final end?
No, yeah, Abernathy made many statements that he was there. Abernathy was moved out of the room. Abernathy and I think Young were moved out of the room, and they were kept outside. They were not in there during this critical time. But I don't want to get into Ralph, because Ralph, there's too many questions I have about Ralph, but not really powerful evidence. But Ralph...
How about Andrew Young?
I have no doubt that Andrew Young had nothing to do with the assassination at all. In fact, Andy Young was a target. He was the military sharpshooters, the special ops guys, had two targets. They were given at Camp Shelby, and their briefing at 4:30 in the morning of the assassination, they were shown two photographs. One was Andy Young, and one was Martin King. So Andy himself was a target. But Ralph himself, I have a lot of questions about Ralph. He was not truthful in terms of the room. They never stayed in that room. They never stayed overnight at the Lorraine. They did go there, and they met people there during the day, but they never stayed overnight. And I had a police detective tell me, a guy I came to trust over the years, he was standing behind the lockers when the King group was going single file past the dead body on the table, and they were led by Ralph. And when Ralph got to Martin's body up to his head, he patted him by the side of the head and said, "Goodbye, old friend." And the detective said he wished he had a camera, because there was this enormous grin on Ralph's face.
There must have been hundreds of grins on the faces of FBI, CIA, bankers, militarists, all kinds of Americans. Big grins on their faces when Martin Luther King died. If this were France, those grins would be wiped off of those sick faces with a guillotine. But this is America. Hey, what time does a football game start and what channel is it on? You know, it makes me really sick to my stomach to think that I fought for years and years to become a citizen of the USA. And now I find out that USA stands for Unlimited Serial Assassins. It's like finding out that your wife has been cheating for years. It is really, really hard to live with. You know, a lot of people ask me, John, what is it about people that you admire and look for? I say the most important things for me are talent, intelligence, a sense of humor, and above all, character. Character trumps them all. You could be dumb as a doornail as far as I'm concerned, but if you have character, which translates to goodness, you are the very, very best of human beings. And Jim Garrison and William F. Pepper had them all in spades, especially character. I am now going to ask Len to close this show for two reasons. First of all, he knew William much better than I did. But William Pepper, aside from writing 7 or 8, 9 great books and dozens of articles that could have and should have changed the world, he was a writer of the greatest poetry that I have ever read. He wrote 20 of the greatest poems, and one of them is called Struggle and Character. And it is on a video where the guitar music in the background is played by William's friend and my friend, Len Osanic. It is so, so beautiful. So, Len, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take us to the closing of this tribute. I'd like you to talk a little bit about your friendship with William, how you came to record these wonderful poems. And then I would like you to close this tribute by playing that magnificent poem that William himself reads.
Thanks, John, for including me in this project. My name's Len Osanic, and hosting Black Op Radio, I had Bill Pepper on my show for, probably at least 30 times over the years. And we talked about his political interests, and we got a friendship together. Once I met him one day in Seattle, when he was speaking at the university there, he told me about his poetry that he'd been writing and thought about putting it to music, and I told him I could do that. So I think back in 2009, we had an album of at least 25 poems set to music, and that took a few years to put together, but finally we put it together. I'm very proud of that, and there's many, many good songs, real good poetry, and I was proud to be part of that. And this is one of the ones, it's always my favorite, even though I've listened to it 100 times. It's called Struggle and Character.
Struggle and Character. Personal struggle affirms a life, without which there is only existence. A personal world in the absence of strife disables the character by indulgence. But if one has to struggle to survive, admitting that struggle takes many forms, the long-term benefits one may derive fosters strength to overcome earthly storms. Survival's struggle hones personal steel, and possibly also self-awareness. Its diet excludes the parasite's meal and other self-serving voraciousness. One should not aspire to be a leader, having not conquered some personal hate. To remain in life's garden a weeder is better than claiming to control fate. Such shallow leaders put in place by special interests whom they serve, from serious debate must hide their face, fleeing from challenge, fear their preserve. Once in place, these human shells show arrogance in the face of dissent, draining water from polluted wells. Emotions, not reason, they ever ferment. Struggle does not independence assure. Corruption can still take a life over. More likely may integrity endure, and truth emerge as a lifelong lover.
There